Good morning, and thank you everyone for joining us. And welcome to today's presentation, COVID Learning, a K-12 Midterm Report. I'm Juana Matias, COO of MassINC, and today we'll be talking about new data from a survey conducted by the MassINC polling group. This is a part of a series of webinars where we at MassINC and the MassINC polling group examine the findings of COVID-19 public opinion research on distinct policy areas. The survey we're digging into today is actually the third in a set of surveys. The first was conducted in the spring before the school year began, and the second took place in the fall as the academic year was getting started. Now that the year is in full swing and the pandemic landscape has shifted with the introduction of vaccines, the time was ripe to check in with parents once more about their K-12 kids' learning experiences. Now, before we get into the results of the survey, I want to emphasize that we are cognizant of the timing of this event, and we understand that by holding it during school hours, not everyone who would like to be here can be here. However, this event is being recorded. The recording will be available on our website, and MassINC polling group research director, Maeve Duggan, is making herself fully accessible for questions or comments and will provide her contact information for anyone who may want to reach out. With that said, for those of you who are here with us today, please use the chat function to ask questions as we go along. They will either get answered in real time by a member of our staff or at the end during the question and answer portion. And now it is truly my pleasure to introduce our presenter and engineer of this poll, Maeve Duggan, Research Director at the MassINC Polling Group. Take it away, Maeve.
Thank you so much, Juana, and welcome everybody. Thank you for your time this morning. Let me go ahead and share my screen and we can get going. All right, start this slideshow up. And I hope you all can see this. Juana, can you nod that you can see my screen? Okay, perfect. Okay, so good morning, everybody. As Juana said, my name is Maeve Duggan, and I am Research Director at the MassINC Polling Group. Today, we're going to be discussing results from the latest in our series of surveys among Massachusetts K-12 parents. Today's results are the third in our series, and we surveyed just over 1,500 parents in Massachusetts, importantly, including oversamples of Black, Latino, and Asian parents. I do want to note the fielding dates of this survey mostly took place in February, along with the first few days in March. I mention this because there's been a lot of movement and discussion since we came out of field in regards to reopening and returning children to the classroom. This survey was conducted on the phone and online in English and in Spanish, and the results were weighted to known population parameters. Lastly, I'd like to thank our sponsor, the Barr Foundation, and also our partners on this project, the Education Trust. As Juana mentioned, my colleague and president of the polling group, Steve Cazella, can be answering your questions in the chat. So please let us know as this presentation goes on if there's anything you'd like answered. I'm going to skip the key findings for now as we are going to discuss them in depth, but they are available in the slide deck, which has been posted into the chat, which will live on our website for future reference. So to set the scene here, the proportion of parents who say that their child is learning in a remote or a hybrid setting still represents the vast majority of parents. 43% say that their child is learning in a fully remote environment, while 46% say that their child is in some sort of a hybrid setup, meaning they're spending some time in person at school and some time learning virtually at home. That leaves 12% of parents who say that their child is learning fully in person. So there are some demographic differences in terms of who is learning in which format. This looks a lot like the previous wave of this survey that we conducted in October in terms of the broad contours of which groups are in which formats. For our all remote learners, lower income and parents of color are more likely to say that their child is learning remotely. In person, we see a much different set of groups. Primarily Catholic and private school parents say that their children are learning in person, along with higher income and white parents. And last but not least, our hybrid learners. These also tend more toward the higher income and white parents, although there's a little more distribution among the groups as a whole. So I think the question on the top of everyone's mind is whether or not to bring children back for in-person learning. We asked parents what they thought the focus should be for the remainder of the year. And we do see that a small majority of parents, 54%, think that the focus should be bringing more children back in person. That leaves 40% who believe that the focus should remain on improving remote learning. When we look at this by school format, we see an almost mirror image when it comes to remote parents. Just over half, 56%, say that 56% of remote parents say that they think the focus should be on improving remote learning. And of course, a part of returning children back to the classroom will be vaccines. We asked parents how quickly they wanted to get their children vaccinated, and the plurality, 45%, say that they would like their child vaccinated as soon as possible once there is an FDA-approved vaccine for children. If we combine that 45% with these next two bars, this represents 80% of parents who would like to get their child vaccinated at some point. However, this does leave about 20% of parents who say that they will either never get their child vaccinated or that they're unsure. This has implications, obviously, for a return to school and school safety, but it also has implications for the general population and achieving herd immunity, as we know that a significant number of children need to be vaccinated in order for the general population to reach herd immunity. We have asked this question of adults in terms of their plans for getting themselves vaccinated in a survey back in December. And I will note that those results looked pretty similar to this distribution, which is to say that parents are pretty much going to do for themselves do for their children what they would do for themselves. Within this question, we do see some differences by demographic, in particular when it comes to income. When we look across the racial and ethnic groups, whether white, Black, Latino, or Asian, we see that there is some more hesitancy on behalf of lower income parents to get their child vaccinated as soon as possible. So you can see across this top bar of the table, those lower income groups, the proportions are a bit lower. When we add up the proportions who say they'll get their child vaccinated at any point in time, those differences are a bit more muted. But we point this out because it does reflect a similar dynamic that we've seen in the rollout of the adult vaccine. So of course, beyond having your own child vaccinated, there are many other people who would be in a school building and part of the school community. So we asked parents if they would support or oppose each of the following groups being required to get the COVID vaccine. Overall, we see broad support for requiring staff and teachers to be required to be vaccinated. There's also majority support to require other children to get vaccinated. However, it's a little less strong than for staff and teachers. So one reason why parents may be eager to get their children back into the classrooms is that we see some persistent gaps in terms of the proportion who think that their child is behind grade level. If we focus in on this dark blue line, 13% of parents said that they thought their child was behind grade level before COVID. That climbed pretty steadily throughout the spring, summer, and fall. It's now evened out at 26%. So roughly a quarter of parents think that their child is now behind grade level. We also conducted 2 focus groups at the end of January. One was among hybrid parents and the other was among remote parents of color. And this issue of academic progress was, of course, top of mind for parents. As you can see from these quotes on the screen, they were very concerned with how to keep their child motivated and engaged in their learning, especially from home. So when we look at these differences in terms of the percentage of parents who think their child is behind grade level by format over time, there are some interesting results. And this is one spot where we would be interested in your feedback. But let's focus in for a moment on the in-person parents. This lightest pink bar is the proportion of in-person parents who say that they think their child is currently behind grade level. That's currently at 31%, up from 17% in October. That, of course, is a pretty sizable jump and even larger than compared to before the pandemic. So this is a little bit puzzling and interesting to us. We've been speculating on what might be behind this jump. A few running theories is, number one, that in-person parents may have been feeling optimistic or enthusiastic at the beginning of the year that their child was back in person after there had been the spring shutdown of schools. Now that time has gone on and they're realizing how much learning their child may have to catch up on, they're sort of more now in line with other parents. Another theory is that the proportion of in-person parents whose child has an IEP or is an ELL student has increased a little bit between these two waves. And we do know that IEP and ELL students are more likely, that their parents are more likely to say they're behind grade level. Whether that accounts for the entirety of this jump, that isn't for sure, but we would be interested if any of you in the comments might have a reaction or an idea, your take of what might be going on behind these particular figures. Meanwhile, perhaps some encouraging news with remote parents. We've seen a slight decrease in the proportion who say that their child's behind grade level, going from 27% in October to 20% now. And the hybrid parents have remained consistent that just about 30% say that their child is behind grade level. I do want to note that being behind grade level is a parent perception. It's not based on a specific assessment or any other type of hard academic measure. So part of what's behind all of these numbers is parent expectations and parent perceptions, which can, of course, vary parent to parent. When we look at a similar breakout by race, we see a certain evening out. This lightest bar is the proportion who say that their child is behind grade level this wave in February, and they're kind of roughly all in the same ballpark now. Of course, in each racial and ethnic group, this does represent a large increase from the figures before the pandemic. So how are parents making these judgments? How do they know what they know? We first asked them a pretty general question about how well informed they feel about their child's academic progress. On the whole, the majority of parents say that they feel at least somewhat well informed. Where we see the differences are in this red bar, which represents the proportion who say that who say that they feel very well informed about their child's academic progress. And there are some differences here by school type and school format. So for example, if we look at public school parents, 39% say that they think their child is they feel very well informed about their child's academic progress. That compares to 70% of private school parents. There's a similar, although less extreme pattern when we look at school format. As you can see, hybrid parents are the least likely to feel very well informed. And just to carry on the pattern that we've seen, not only in this wave, but in the previous wave, hybrid parents across most measures have been having a more difficult time or finding their child's academics more challenging. And this certainly applies when we ask parents to compare how well informed they feel about their child's progress compared to other children in their class, other children in their grade at school, and other children in their grade statewide. So the hybrid parents here are this lightest pink bar, and you can see that across all three measures, hybrid parents are less likely to feel well informed about how their child's academic progress compares. We're also interested in where specifically parents are getting information that might be forming these judgments. Overall, we see that just about 2/3 of parents say that they get information on their child's academic progress from emails from the teacher or school. Just about half say that they use some sort of online platform or dashboard. Then there's a little bit of a drop off, but just about 1/3 of parents say that they've had a parent-teacher conference, that they get calls or texts from the teacher or school, and that they're having check-ins with their own child. What's interesting here is some of the more subtle demographic differences. For instance, if we concentrate here on online platforms and dashboards, we see that white parents are somewhat more likely than Black and Latino parents to say that they get information from these tools. The same applies to higher income parents and also parents with at least a college degree. On the other hand, Black and Latino parents are a bit more likely to say that they get information from some of these more direct and more personalized tools, like emails from the teacher or school, or also down here, calls or texts from the teacher or the school. This issue of communication also came up in the focus groups. Overall, the sentiment was that in the beginning of the year, there was some frustration as some of the odds and ends got worked out of how communication and progress reports would kind of work between teachers and parents. But overall, parents also described a real appreciation and improvement for the communication about their child's academics. And on the whole, were relatively satisfied with the information that they receive. We were also interested to look at some more specific assessment tools. So things like report cards and progress reports, feedback from teachers and staff, and then grades or scores on individual tests and assignments. These kinds of direct and personalized assessment tools are viewed as helpful by the wide majority of parents. So as you can see, just going down the line, 78%, 73%, and 68% find those types of specific and personalized feedback tools helpful. When we asked about standardized testing, the first thing that I would point out here is that these gray bars represent the proportion of parents who say that they haven't received these types of results. And I want to clarify that for the MCAS results, we specifically asked about results from previous years, as we know, of course, that MCAS hasn't yet been conducted for this year. So not only is it notable that there's a much larger proportion of parents who say they haven't received these results at all, but also that the parents who have received them are more divided on whether or not those results have been helpful in guiding their judgments of their child's academic progress. Specifically, to zone in a little bit more on standardized testing, there are some differences here by race and ethnicity. I want to be specific that this chart is calculated only among those parents who have received results. So among parents who have received either MCAS results or standardized test results other than MCAS, we see that Black, Latino, and Asian parents are somewhat more likely to find those results helpful than white parents. So these top 4 rows are looking at the MCAS results specifically, and then the bottom half of this chart is focusing on the results of standardized tests besides MCAS. And you can see these differences by race and ethnicity. So moving forward, what would parents like to do in order to make up for lost learning time? Certainly where we see support, this 57%, is for summer education programs. Support is a bit more divided in terms of whether or not to start the school year earlier than usual next year. And where there's certain opposition is in making the school day longer next year. Of course, a large part of this year is not only what's been happening with school, but also what's been happening at home. Especially for hybrid parents, the juggling act of school, work, and childcare has been a difficult one. So we asked parents how easy or difficult it's been to do each of these things. And across the board, once again, those hybrid parents are this light pink bar, and they certainly find it more difficult to manage their child's school schedule and to balance work and childcare in particular. And this was certainly a theme in the focus groups that we conducted. Hybrid parents described the difficulty and the challenge of keeping their children engaged in school remotely, in trying to balance that with their own work responsibilities, especially if they had multiple children who were learning at home or in some sort of hybrid scenario. And then also just trying to find childcare, especially if, for the hybrid parents in particular, if their child's school schedule was changing. And then another part of children that we need to consider is more their holistic health. So besides their academics, how's their physical health doing? So we asked this series of questions, and screen time certainly sticks out. We know that it was a concern of parents before COVID, and its screen time has of course become much more of a reality for many students across the state. And we find that 60% of parents, this red bar on the left, think that their child gets too much screen time. On the other hand, just about half or over half of parents, these two dark blue bars, say that they think their child does not get enough outdoor time and does not get enough physical activity. Perhaps the bright spot is sleep. The majority of parents, nearly 2/3, say that their child is getting enough sleep. So well done, parents, on the sleep front. Then the last topic that we'll cover today is mental and emotional health. This was a topic that came through loud and clear in the focus groups. This is just a sampling of some of the quotes, but there were really vivid and colorful descriptions of how much parents have struggled just to keep their child happy day to day. So we wanted to make sure that we dedicated some serious survey space to addressing the mental and emotional health needs of our students. And the data certainly reflects the sentiment in the focus groups. If we combine these two bars on the left, 60% of parents say that they are either very or somewhat concerned about their child's mental and emotional health. And what's striking here is that across the major demographic groups, nearly every single one, a majority of parents say that they are very or somewhat concerned. So it just speaks to the impact of this year, that all of these parents from so many different walks of life have similar concerns about their child's mental and emotional health. Another way to look at this is in terms of impacts. This is a series of questions that we also asked last wave in October. This chart is showing the percentage of parents who say that this year has had a negative impact on their child in each of these following categories. So if we start over here on the right with academic learning, we can see that in February, just about half of parents said that this year has had a negative impact on their child's academics. That's relatively unchanged from October. Certainly half of parents saying that it's been a negative experience is not good, but it has leveled out. It has been a steady trend. On the other hand, when we look at some of the more social or emotional measures, this is where we've seen change. So for example, opportunities for friendship. We've seen a slight uptick in the percentage overall who say that their child, who say that this year has had a negative impact on their child. But what's really notable here is this dark red bar, which represents the proportion who say this year has had a major negative impact on their child. We see here almost a 10-point jump. So that's a really notable increase. Somewhat similarly, in terms of mental and emotional health, we see that overall, the percentage who say there's been a negative impact on their child has also upticked. So when we look at this as a whole, there's certainly concern among parents about their child's academics, but where we've seen the most change, the most fluctuation, is on the social, mental, and emotional front. This chart takes a bit of explaining, so I'll try to go through it slowly. But each bar here represents the net impact in each of these categories. So the percentage of parents who said that this year has had a positive impact minus the percent who said the year had a negative impact. And if we start over here with the in-person parents, once again, we're seeing a pretty dramatic change from them. Back in October, in-person parents were netting out in the positive, that this year had been having a positive impact on their children. That's flipped. Almost the mirror image now, in-person parents are netting out in the negative. So while that is, a notable change, I will point out and emphasize that for the remote and hybrid parents, they have been down and they have stayed down. Especially for these hybrid parents, the negative impacts, they've been clear and consistent about them since October across all of these categories, that the impacts on their child have been negative and have really stayed down. Just to parse this out a little bit more, if we look specifically at positive impacts, I want to focus here on academic learning specifically. And there are some important differences here by race and ethnicity. Certainly across all of the racial and ethnic groups, at least the plurality of parents say that there's been a negative impact this year. But it is notable that, just about a third of Black and Latino parents say that there has been a positive impact on their child's academics. And to skip ahead here, if we look at the same slide, but broken out by income group, we see a somewhat similar pattern where the lower income parents are saying that they're more likely to say there's been a positive impact on their child's academics compared to these highest income parents. So taken together, we see that lower income and parents of color are a bit more likely to say there's been something positive about this year. And that's really worthwhile to uncover and understand more, especially as schools and policymakers look toward the future and how to bring children back into the classroom, perhaps in the spring and certainly in the fall. So this question came pretty directly out of the focus groups. There was this sentiment that parents expressed as they discussed their child's mental and emotional health, that in terms of academics, they felt like their child was kind of in the same boat as everybody else. That certainly there have been challenges and struggles this year and they're concerned about academics, but they feel like more or less their child might be equally ahead or behind as other children. But the challenge of day-to-day keeping their child happy, keeping them in good spirits was what was more top of mind, more immediate and more concerning to them. So we decided to turn this into a survey question and pose it to all of our parents. And what we found is when on balance, when parents think about which is more concerning, their child's mental or emotional health or their child's academic progress, the plurality, 42%, do say that both of those things weigh equally on them. But what's interesting here is that we see almost double the proportion of parents who say they're more concerned about mental and emotional health than they are about their child's academic progress. So just really hammering home the point that mental and emotional health is a big part of the story this year. And then this chart breaks out these results by income group. And I think this is a good example of how parent perception can play into the results here. So parents in the highest income group are the most likely to say that they are concerned about their child's mental and emotional health. This could certainly be because we know that children from affluent backgrounds may have better prospects, and so their parents may not be as concerned about the long-term prospects on their child's academics, which may not be the same case for some of these lower income groups. But just to emphasize the point about parent perception and expectation and how that may change their views. So we also wanted to know about the resources that schools have been offering about on mental and emotional health issues. And first, we just asked a general question about overall satisfaction with the mental and emotional health resources offered by their child's school. Overall, we see high satisfaction. Just about 2/3 say that they're satisfied. When we look at that by school type and by school format, there are some differences. Parents in public schools are less likely to say that they're satisfied, along with parents whose children are in remote or hybrid learning formats. And then this is our last slide for right now. We also asked about some specific mental and emotional health resources that may be available. Certainly for these first three, in terms of mental health counselors, information about resources, and having dedicated social time, a majority of parents say that this is offered at their child's school. What is most notable, I think, about this slide, however, is this gray bar representing the proportion of parents who say that they are unsure if each of these resources is offered. As we think about this in terms of the majority of parents who say that they're concerned about their child's mental and emotional health, this may represent kind of a knowledge gap between the need and the services available. So I will leave it there for now. I want to make sure that we get to Ben Forman's presentation. So thank you all very much for your time, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions you may have. Okay, Juana, I'm going to stop sharing and it's back to you.
Thank you, Maeve, for walking us through that data. A lot to unpack. And now we are joined by MassINC Research Director, Ben Forman, who will discuss how student opportunity funds can be leveraged to address lost learning and the social emotional needs of students. Ben, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks, Juana. And thanks, Maeve, for that unbelievable presentation and all the work you guys have been doing. It's incredibly important. I want to just start with the big idea, if it is a big idea at all, that the stimulus funding we're going to get can serve as a bridge to full implementation of the Student Opportunity Act. I think people are still taking in President Biden's signing of a nearly $2 trillion stimulus package last week that comes on top of a very significant stimulus package last December. And if you just look at the money that's going to bring to public schools in Massachusetts, it's $2.3 billion that will be available over the next couple of years. And these funds are progressively awarded to high need districts, much the same way the Student Opportunity Act funds will be flowing to gateway cities and other high need districts around the state. But as we consider this and consider its potential to serve as a bridge, I think we got to think about the condition here, which is this is if the legislature can provide assurance that it will fully fund the law on time. When the Student Opportunity Act was signed, it was done so with an asterisk that said, you know, we recognize the need of these districts and we will provide the resources if they are available to us, which I think meant to all the school leaders that there's a very high likelihood that they wouldn't receive all the funds they had been promised. And when that's the case, people act very differently. I think what you build when you have certainty that the dollars will be there going forward is very different than how you spend if you don't have certainty. And we have a kind of a history of not following through on promises that people have internalized. And I think as a result of that, we save a bit, but we lose a lot. You know, at the end of the day, we'll probably spend 80% of what was promised under the Student Opportunity Act, but we'll get 50% of the impact because nobody knew when it was going to come, if it was going to come, and could they count on it. If we say, look, we are committed to addressing structural inequality in our Commonwealth, and part of that means consistently fully funding our schools, and we're going to fund the Student Opportunity Act with the first dollar of state revenue, the outcomes we're going to get are going to be very different. And that's the whole idea here is, can this dollars that we have available to us today forward fund the work, accelerate the work, and is that done with confidence that the state dollars will be there to sustain the work that takes place? So I just want to kind of talk through a couple of scenarios based on what we saw a little bit in Maeve's poll, starting with summer. Summer is something that urban communities have wanted to invest in for years and years and years. They've known that their students haven't had near equal access to high quality structured summer learning opportunities, and that they were losing a lot of momentum and a lot of learning was lost over the summer. There was recently a random controlled trial of students in elementary school who were either put in a control group or put in a structured summer program. It was in 5 cities around the country. Boston was one of those cities. And the results were very strong. We saw them in the fall. We saw that in tests and assessments the following spring for students who attended more than 2 years in a row of structured summer programs. We saw higher effects that were on the order of something like 20 or 30% of the progress we'd expect a student to make over the school year. So essentially, over the summer months, they weren't losing, they were continuing to make steady progress. But notably in these findings, the students who experienced the real gains were the ones who were attended the programs. They weren't forced to go, this was summer. So attendance is thought to be, an indicator of quality. So if we could build strong summer programs and students had a good experience, they went and they learned. Often we've done summer with whatever money we can cobble together, which means we build a program in a few weeks' time. What's going to happen this summer and next summer is going to be probably nothing short of amazing in terms of the investments that we're going to put in to building summer programs all around the state. And if we can have faith that we're going to be able to sustain that for the long term, that work, I think holds real strong promise. But again, it comes down to, do we know those Student Opportunity Act dollars are going to be there when the federal dollars are no longer available to us? We've got a great head start on this. Boston and Boston After School for Beyond has been working for years on quality in summer programs, has been looking at how you assess and measure progress. And I think they're ready to help the rest of the state build out really strong, high quality summer programs. So this is an incredible opportunity that we have to realize, and it's here before us now. In terms of the social emotional findings that Maeve pointed out and the real concerns that parents have, this has been a concern of districts. Again, for years and years, one of the highest priority things for them was social emotional learning, social emotional support systems, making sure that they had the school psychologists, the school adjustment counselors, behavioral health specialists on board to meet the needs of their students and ensure that they were ready and able to learn. This is just a page from Worcester's Student Opportunity Act plan, which gives a sense of how they were planning to immediately start adding personnel to undertake this work. Again, with the dollars they're getting from stimulus relief funds from the federal government, they can hire these people tomorrow. The question will be, can they keep them in place, and can they build real structures with them? If you're doing social emotional support well, you're part of a team, you're working with providers in the community, and making sure that there are all sorts of tiered interventions that you can provide students, that it's aligned with your social emotional learning curriculum. All that takes years and years of work. Much of it has been done, but this really gives us an opportunity to accelerate that and make good on the promise of social emotional learning and social emotional supports. We didn't cover this in this poll, but the last two polls look very closely at digital equity and access to computers and access to internet services for Gateway City households in particular. And we were finding that somewhere between a quarter to a third or more of households didn't have the technology that was required for 21st century learning today. We have made unbelievable progress on this problem in the last year. I think everybody believes that the extreme levels of digital equity we went into the pandemic with are untenable, that will no longer be the way we do business, that we have to find a way to ensure that every household has access to the internet and access to the computing devices they need to position their students to be 21st century learners. There's lots of federal money available specifically for this. And I think one of the important challenges is going to be, how do we budget and how do we support these investments sustainably going forward? Again, this issue didn't come up in the poll specifically, but I think one of the big questions coming out of the pandemic is, how are we going to rebuild our early learning systems to make sure that parents are able to go back to work and have a high quality environment for providing care for younger children. This is something that Gateway Cities and Boston have been working on for years. How do we make sure that there are resources available to provide quality early learning experiences to all children? They had a federal grant several years ago that many did pre-K expansion work with. There's a small state grant program that has supported that work with the federal funds drying up. But the real question here is, can we get to scale? This work requires real intentional effort between public school districts and private providers in their communities. It has a lot of promise to align learning and instruction between the private systems and the public systems so that kids enter kindergarten ready to learn. But it's expensive, it's hard work, It's exactly the kind of thing that we don't do if we don't know that we have money to sustain it long term. So again, this is an opportunity where if we can take the federal resources and we can ensure the Student Opportunity Act dollars behind them, we can make real progress. And then just lastly, I'll leave with early college, which is something MassINC has been working on for a number of years. And the more data that we see, the more compelling the idea of giving more students the opportunity to take classes while they're in high school and earn lots of college credit, so the barrier to completing a college degree is lower, and we don't have the extreme gaps we see by race and income in college completion in Massachusetts. The first cohort of early college students that graduated in 2019 went on to college at about a 21 percentage point higher rate than their peers. We've seen that number come down with the students who transitioned in the fall. Unfortunately, the pandemic had an impact on them as well, but they still were moving on at much higher rates than their peers. And the number of students in early college this year is even greater. It grew significantly despite the pandemic. And all the data that we've seen so far on this year's class of early college students shows they're doing very, very well. As we think about high school in particular, I think one of the lessons from the pandemic is all students learn differently in different settings. And we really have to think about what our portfolio of high schools look like. What are the different sets of learning opportunities that are going to challenge each and every student? I think there's no question that early college has to be in the mix there. And it's an example of something that costs a little bit more, but delivers a whole lot more. And again, we can scale this today with the resources that are being made available from the stimulus funds, but communities have to have the certainty that if they're promising students the opportunity to be in early college, beginning in community, so you're all on the same page for delivering, and then really rigorously monitoring how well it's working. We can't just take one measure. There needs to be multiple measures of a program's performance, including qualitative work with students and families, really understanding how it is impacting them. That's something we take for granted often. It's something we often don't have time for, and we pay a very heavy price for that at the end of the day. I think one of the challenges will always be sustaining the Student Opportunity Act, given how progressive it is. And that makes it incumbent on the communities who are receiving those funds to show that they produce results with them. So we got to get ahead of that, plan early for data and evaluation, and make sure that what we're producing is something that people are going to respect and appreciate and value, so that we can continue to sustain the investments we need to make in the communities that are serving our highest need learners. So that's all for now. But again, I just want to thank Steve and Maeve and their team for all the great work that they've done with public opinion research.
Ben, thank you so much for such a phenomenal presentation. You touched on so many important points and brought into the fold a lot of the findings in thinking about how do we, bring in student opportunity dollars to leverage some of the needs that COVID is showing our students have. And I could not agree with you more. Yes, our state faces a certain deficit, but underserved students should have never, to begin with, had to deal with not receiving an adequate education, and we should not have them wait any longer. So we look forward to seeing SOA funds being fully funded in our districts so that they can be responsive to some of the complexity that's kind of derived in light of COVID, and that has always existed because we hadn't funded these districts to begin with adequately. However, we now have many questions that are coming in through the chat function. I want to encourage those who are still tuned in to please share your questions, even your statements if you'd like. We'd love to hear from you and your perspectives. And I'm going to start off with a question for Maeve. This is from Charles. He asks, how do parents know if their child is behind or at grade level? Do they have testing or other data, or is it personal perception?
That's a good question. So thank you, Charles. I think in general, it's a good question for survey data of how do we know what we know. In this particular case, the question was posed to parents. Do you think that your child is ahead, behind, or at grade level? So it is a measure of parent perception, which is of course different from a specific assessment tool or any kind of standardized test or anything that could be applied broadly across the whole population of students. So this is a measure of parent perception specifically.
Thank you, Maeve. Ben, there's a question for you, and I kind of want to add my perspective and then yield the floor to you to get your perspective. And it's, are there any policies aimed at helping school administrators, districts increase the use of mental health services among students of color? And I think, you know, when we're sitting down internally as a team and talking about these results and coming up with, you know, some clarification as to why we're seeing what we're seeing. I remember, you know, being the child of immigrant parents in the Merrimack Valley, and mental health and social and emotional well-being was just not something that I remember being a priority for my parents because of cultural taboos and limitations that they had in their upbringing. But what could our administrators and districts be doing to kind of improve services among students of color, knowing that there could be limitations like the ones that I was faced with parents who just had a knowledge gap in terms of how that was really important in my overall well-being?
That's a really good question. I remember some years ago, a friend of mine who's a pediatrician at a community health center once told me that they didn't screen students for depression because if they did, somebody would be flagged and there weren't services to provide counseling to all the students who would need it. And so it's always been something that I've wondered about is how do we measure the need versus the availability of services? And many schools do universal screenings to understand all of a student's social and emotional needs and connect them to appropriate services. But you know, we haven't translated those screens into reliable data to tell us where supply is well short of demand. Over the last, you know, 5 or 6 years, a lot has changed in the landscape in terms of behavioral health parity and improving our behavioral health systems. And the pandemic, I think, dramatically changes things as well with the introduction of telehealth. And I think we've heard from many of our communities that telehealth has been a game changer in terms of connecting people who had difficulty accessing services to care, particularly behavioral health care. You know, I think that's something we're going to be following closely. But I think, you know, a real question is where throughout the state, regionally, are healthcare systems short of the providers they need to meet all the needs of the residents in their communities? And how does that look like, particularly from a cultural competency standpoint? Especially when you're providing behavioral health care, it's important to know the culture and the language of those you're trying to serve. And often those are the providers that we're lacking the most. So, you know, I think there's a lot of work to do there, especially on the data front, so that we can really understand where the needs are and how well we're meeting them.
Couldn't have been better stated. Maeve?
If I could just jump in, because Ben mentioned mental health screeners, and it was the last bar on the last slide of the presentation, so it's a good moment to be able to highlight it. This was the one item in the battery of mental health resources that we asked about where less than half of parents said that it was offered at their school, and almost identical proportion said that they were in fact unsure if it was available or not. So I think that speaks to Ben's point about availability and kind of the knowledge gap of mental health services that we mentioned in the presentation. So just to call out those figures, 35% of parents said that they were unsure if their child's school offered mental health screeners.
Thank you, Maeve. That's a really important point. And a question for you, and I think I have a follow-up to this question myself. It seems like this poll was taken when things were changing rapidly. Are there plans to do more down the road? And then my question to that question is, you know, we saw that more than 50% of parents said their child is not engaging in physical activity, which has huge and direct implications in terms of social and mental well-being. Have there been any questions around, you know, is sports still available in your high school or elementary school? What does that look like? And I ask just because, you know, in my community, I've heard complaints from parents around, you know, our students aren't able to do extracurricular activities, but down the road in Andover they are. So any gauging around that, especially because we know physical activity can help with someone's emotional and mental state.
Yeah, definitely. So to address your first question, short answer is yes, we are planning to do more research before the end of this academic year. So we have one more round of focus groups that we're hoping to conduct in April. And then we have one more round of a survey to hopefully conduct maybe sometime in May. So in the chat, if there are topics or questions that you think would be particularly pertinent as we are forward looking into next year especially, please do let us know. We're absolutely in the information gathering phase right now as we plan for those next pieces of research. And then Juana, to your second question about physical activities, this wasn't something that we dove into more detail in the survey, but I can say that from the focus groups that we conducted in January, the anecdotes were really variable. So some parents said that their kids were still part of activities, whether that was formally through school or a more informal network of parents who made sure that their kids met up at parks or something like that. But I'll also say, you know, in particular, this wave of the survey was conducted in February for the most part, and was, you know, looking back over some of the colder months that we have here in New England. And that certainly has implications for if kids can get outside, if they can play, and, you know, might have something also to do with some of those upticks that we saw in terms of negative impacts for social, mental, and emotional measures. That has just been more difficult when it's dark at 4:30 and 20 degrees to be able to get your kid outside and safely socializing with other children.
That's a great point, and I think it lines up a comment / question from Will Austin. Hi, Will. It's great to have you on. And his question is as follows: should we consider time of year as a factor? He says, I can tell you from working in schools for 15 years and as a parent, the lowest time of satisfaction / happiness and the highest time of bad stuff happening is in February, March. Maeve, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a possibility. In any survey you conduct, you need to consider your fielding period. So, you know, I referred to in my own life, you know, the dark days of COVID winter. I think that applies to everybody. And I think Will brings up a good point about some of the natural rhythms of the school year that have been observed even in non-COVID years. So that could definitely be at play. Yes.
Great. Ben, a question from you from C. Stevens. If districts choose to have a more robust summer program and have the funds, does there have to be a consensus between the school committee, the central office, and the employees / unions? Or are the summer programs run independently so programs can be expanded and staffed quickly if needed?
Yeah, that one probably goes beyond my expertise, but to the extent the funds are flowing through the local education agency, the school district, right? The school district is going to have a lot of say over how that program is provided. It could certainly be through any sort of combination of agencies and community-based organizations, certainly. I think if you go back to that random controlled trial, there was a lot of discussion about the ability of the people. Those programs delivered academic content, right? And I'm assuming we're going to want to deliver academic content over these summers as we work on catching students up. They also worked on enrichment and social emotional growth, and they measured gains in each area. But it was really the academic content gains that were impressive. And I think they found that in programs where they were the school teachers who knew the kids, they had the most success in creating a learning environment during the summer months where it's obviously super challenging that led to good things.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you. Maeve, a question for you, and I know we're coming close to time, but I want to get in these last couple of questions because I think they bring up really important points. When asked about summer programs, did parents specify why they supported, opposed the initiative? From an emotional health perspective, would you expect the relationships between parents and children to improve if they had access to summer programs?
You know, that's a good question. We didn't address it that specifically in this survey because we're trying to fit a lot of content into one survey. So the extent to which we can dig into any given issue is somewhat limited. But what I can say is that back in the first round of this survey, back in June, we asked a somewhat similar question. I want to qualify it because it referred specifically to remote summer education programs, since it was such a different time in the pandemic and it was just not an option that anybody would be in person in school. But when we asked back in June if parents would support remote summer education programs, we saw somewhat similar breaks. So if the commonality between then and now is the idea of continuing some sort of learning opportunity over the summer, then that's certainly been consistent over time.
Great. And just a quick follow-up question for you, Maeve, and then one final question for Ben. Did you poll on how remote and hybrid learning is impacting English language learners or students who have an individualized education plan? Any information in terms of how they are doing?
Yes, so first of all, Steve has posted the crosstabs in the chat, but I'll highlight them as well. There's so much more data that we have available. We just didn't have the time to get to it all today. And that includes full breakdowns of every question by whether a parent's child has an IEP or is an ELL student. But more specifically, Juana, yes, we do see differences by IEP and ELL. Speaking broadly, that those students, their parents are more likely to see some negative impacts and things like that. So I wish we had more time. I would point people to the crosstabs, and maybe it's something that we can also highlight some interesting findings on social media or maybe in a forthcoming blog post.
Excellent. Ben, last question. And it's a question, again, that really intrigues me because I grew up in a Latino household and know how loud it can be, know how distracting it can be. Relating to the digital divide, is there any data on households where multiple children are learning remotely and what that looks like?
Actually, I think the best data we have on that might come from Maeve and Steve. When they did their last poll, I think they did ask, do you have enough devices for each child in the family? So that's probably as close as we could get. You know, I did, other than districts themselves providing information that they're collecting. I think that, you know, the short answer is we're not all the way to where we want to be. We've made incredible progress, but we still have some ways to go to ensure that we have enough computers for all the students in each household. I don't know if Maeve wants to add to that.
Yeah, so technology was something that we asked about both in the June and in the October survey. And there were some racial and income differences by not only who had access, but specifically we asked about if you have enough devices or fast enough internet access, as we know that it's not just about, do you have one computer at home when, you know, mom, dad, and Betty and Sue are all trying to be on Zoom at the same time. So yes, I would point people toward the previous surveys that we've done, which are available on our website. And this also reminds me that I was remiss. I forgot to put up my very last slide in the deck, which called out our website, which is massincpolling.com/education. And you can find all of the results from all of our surveys there. And I'll also put my email in the chat, which was the other thing that we had promised people, since we know that this is being recorded during a time during school hours. So please do contact us. We'd love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Maeve. And as we think about future public opinion surveys, learning more about beyond just the digital divide and devices, but what is the environment like? Is it conducive to learning in a home? Because I was really shocked and surprised with, you know, how parents who are lower in the socioeconomic standing and parents who are parents of color really felt like students were doing better in the home, but it would be great to gauge whether their home really has an environment where the child is learning it when it comes to academics. Well, that is all the time we have here today. Thank you, everyone thank you to everyone who tuned in. A huge thank you to Ben and Maeve for such a phenomenal presentation, such rich information that we hope help inform, you know, our elected officials, public servants around what we should be doing to ensure that all students are receiving the education they need. Do keep an eye out for future events like this. The MassINC polling group has and continues to put out meaningful findings on Massachusetts residents during this pandemic and beyond. And there will be more polls like this to come. If you missed any of today's event, like Maeve said, it is being recorded and will be available at massincpolling.com, as will the details from the poll. Take care and thank you for being here.